How can we be heard so long as we're nobody yet? Unknown, economically dependent, and supposed to get somewhere.
Is this working? Yeah. Well, first of all, nobody is nobody. And if you want to have, there are very good models as to what young people can do. They've achieved a great deal. So let's go back, say, 50 years and go to North Carolina in the United States or Georgia in the United States. At that point, young people who were facing far harsher difficulties than you are, young black kids, decided to sit in on restaurants, to insist on being waited in restaurants, which was illegal for blacks at the time. So a small group of young kids, college students, went and sat in at a bar in a diner. The police came, took them out, threw them in jail. I'm sure it wasn't very pleasant. The next day, more came back and did it again. After a couple of years, it ended up really revolutionizing the country. That's one of the things that sparked the civil rights movement. They were at a lot of them were at Spelman College, a black college. They had virtually no support from the faculty. 2 faculty members supported them. Both were thrown out. One was Howard Zinn, who you may know, my old friend who died 2 years ago. He was a faculty member. He supported the students. He was expelled. The students themselves went on. A lot of them joined the group that became the Freedom Riders. At that point, some white students from the North came down to join them. And they rode in buses through the South trying to register blacks that couldn't register then. It wasn't easy. Several of them got murdered. Others were beaten, thrown into prisons. I was down there for demonstrations, and you could see, watching while state police were beating people, young kids mostly, driving them up they were fleeing to the steps of the federal building where the state police are not allowed to go. And the federal building was lined with federal marshals sent from Washington who were throwing them back into the streets. That's the way the government was protecting them. They achieved a great deal. Martin Luther King, who was an extremely important person, would have been the first to tell you that he was riding the groundswell that they developed. And that's by no means the only case. Take my own university, MIT. MIT was practically 100% funded by the Pentagon, which, contrary to what a lot of people believe, means it was extremely free. The Pentagon didn't care what you did. They wanted to create the economy of the future. That was their job. It's highly undemocratic. They were using public resources the government used public resources on the pretext of defense to develop computers, the internet, microelectronics, and so on. That's the way the high-tech economy developed. But it was a very passive place, very passive, acquiescent, people doing their work, not paying much attention to anything. There were about 5 students who decided to try to stir the place up. Some of them you may know. One was Michael Albert, who now runs ZNet. Another was Steve Shalom, who's Pete Boehmer, a couple others. And they just kind of began organizing groups around the campus. By 1968, they had so radicalized the campus that Mike Albert was elected student president on a platform so radical you can barely believe it. Well, he was thrown out. We had to get him back in, and usual things happened. But the point is that university's never been the same to this day. Now it's active, a lot of participation, totally different relationships among people, and it's a center of activism. And things like that happen all the time. There's a tremendous amount that young people can do. In fact, if you look at take, say, Tahrir Square in Cairo, that was mostly organized by fairly young people, I guess in their 20s mostly, tech savvy, began reaching out to others. They didn't really expect much at the beginning, but within a couple of weeks, they had half of Egypt out there, and they overthrew a dictatorship. They got a long way to go, but it was a major event, again, initiated by young people who were committed and active. And there are plenty of other examples. You can be heard, all right.
In linguistics, you have wondered whether language is an optimal solution.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think there is an optimal solution in politics as well? Or should we sometimes accept the least bad option?
Well, if there is an optimal solution, I'm not smart enough to figure out what it is. There's just too much we don't know about human beings and about societies. A lot would have to be learned by experimentation, trying things, see if they work, try other things, and so on. And in fact, this is a pretty traditional view on the left. So say, take Karl Marx. You read through all of his works, you find practically nothing on post-capitalist society. A couple of sentences scattered around here and there. So in a post-capitalist society, everyone would fish in the morning and grow his garden in the afternoon, a couple of lines like that. And there was a reason for it. He believed in workers' democracy. His conception was that there would be a popular revolution, working people would take control of their own fate and their own institutions, and then they would work out what the society ought to be like. He didn't have a prescription. He had some ideas about general principles, but not a description. On the other hand, there were people on the left, still are, Mike Albert, who I mentioned, is one, who think that you can give a very detailed account of what a future society ought to be like. And they've worked out, detailed proposals, which you could try out right now, even within the present society. Well, between these two extremes, there are lots of approaches that people have taken, and you have to decide how much you think you understand. I don't think I understand very much, so I don't feel I'm more on Marx's side. I think these things will have to be worked out. I doubt that there's anything that you could call an optimal solution. People are just too different. They live in too many different ways. There are probably many possible peaks that can be approached, and life will be a lot more interesting if there's diversity in outcomes.
How come we live in an open society with a lot of information and yet we know so little?
I understand.
Sorry. How come we live in an open society with a lot of information yet we know so little?
Actually, I add a little personal touch. About 25 years ago, I was asked by a publisher to write a book. Finally came out with a different publisher called Knowledge of Language. The reason it came out with a different publisher was because I included in the book one chapter that the original publisher refused to publish. It was in part about this question. Most of the book was about what I called Plato's problem, the problem of how we know so much with so little information. The last chapter was about something I called Orwell's problem, this one. How come we know so little with so much information? So those are the last, and then I went on and gave the reasons. It's not very profound. The publisher wasn't going to allow that, so we got to know little. But the answer's straightforward. It's the kind of thing I was talking about. I mean, there are concerted efforts to make sure that you know very little and understand very little, which is even more important, even with so much information about. So when you go to school, you don't read about the first 9/11. You don't read about Reagan's war on terror. You do read about Solzhenitsyn and Havel and others, and about our courage in supporting them, but you don't read about the Jesuit intellectuals, or the war against the church, or the effort to destroy the attempt to bring back the Christianity of the Gospels. I mean, those are things you just don't read about. They're there. You can find them. We live in open societies. You can go to the library and get the information about them, but it's a research project, and that's conscious. It's partly it's internalized by educated people. You're kind of brought up that way yourself, so that's the way you see things, and it's more convenient, and so on. And if you break out of the mold, there are difficulties. In our societies like ours, the difficulties aren't very severe, but they're there. And it's easier not to face difficulties. It's easier to come to believe what it's convenient to believe. So these various factors, some quite conscious, others just sort of normal human reactions, lead to a situation in which there's tons of information out there, but you don't know it. Or if you know it, you don't understand it.
Several people are asking you to express your opinion on the WikiLeaks.
Well, the WikiLeaks, I'm often asked, do I think Julian Assange was a hero or a devil? I don't think either. I think it's just a person doing his civic responsibility. It's a civic responsibility to help people know and understand what power systems are up to. They don't like it, of course, no matter what power system it is. They'd rather have their workings be secret from the public. But what right do they have to keep their workings secret from the public? Technically, they're supposed to be our representatives. We should know everything they're doing. You can imagine there might be some cases in which information has to be kept, in which there's an argument for keeping information secret. But you have to make the argument. The burden of proof is always on a power system that says this has to be secret. Maybe sometimes they can meet it. So, for example, take the Pentagon Papers.